Any questions? A writer I knew some years ago, Robert L. Fish, a fine writer and a very nice gentleman, once did that after he was introduced, you know, just stood there waiting for a while. Then he went into his talk, of course, which I will do, but I think it will probably serve us all best if I do make this primarily questions and answers. So I'll talk for a bit, but then I'd like to respond to questions, because you have a better idea of what you'd like me to talk about than I do. I assure you, and I think that'll probably serve us best. I have to say that right now I feel a little bit like Madonna's latest boyfriend, in that I know what I'm supposed to do, but I'm not sure how I can make it interesting for you. So I will see what I come up with. I've thought about this evening for a while, and the notion of a master class and that seems to be predicated upon the notion that the person conducting the class has some knowledge to impart. And I'm not sure that's the case here. I'm not sure that's often the case with writing, because unlike several of the other arts, there's not a lot of data to be learned. This whole process does not come out of information, really. You know, in the graphic arts, if a painter is teaching a class, he can show you how to blend colors. He can show you how to create perspective. And one painter looking at another painter's work can ask, how did you do this, how did you do that, and so on. The thing about writing is that the process is self-evident. There's nothing hidden there. How did you write this book, sir? Well, I took these particular words and I put them in the order that you see them in, and that's how I did it, you know. And there's not much more to say about technique. There are things one learns how to do, but one learns how to do them by one's own trial and error, and by seeing what other people did. And what other people did, as I said, is self-evident. It's right there in the work. It's sometimes easier to see this, to see what works and what doesn't, and how the writer did what he did, with work that's less skillfully done. When something is smooth enough and perfect enough, you don't see the bones. The best job any writer ever had, I think, is one that I had, and one that a great many of us did have, and that was actually just half a block from here, at the corner of 5th Avenue and 47th Street. I worked as an editor at the Scott Meredith Agency, which was, in addition to representing and frequently misrepresenting some professional clients, it also existed as a fee agency. You sent them your manuscript and a check, and you got a letter back, presumably from Scott himself, detailing exactly what was wrong with your manuscript, but explaining that you were clearly an extremely talented writer and would love to see more of your work and more of your checks. And it was an extremely profitable enterprise. And in the course of it, Scott did some things that he probably could have gone to jail for, and any number of things that I trust he's gone to hell for. But what he did for those of us who worked for him was it was the best possible learning experience a wannabe writer could have. Because every day I went in there and I read a cartload of inferior work. Now, occasionally there was something that was professional in there, but very, very infrequently. And, you know, if I found something that I thought we could sell, I could pass it on to the next man up the line. And more often than not, I learned not to do that often unless it really worked. And I had a reasonably good eye. I found a confession writer out of that slush pile, and she sent in 2 stories at once, and I looked at them, and I handed them to the next man, the pro man, and said, you can sell these. And they both sold to the first market that saw them, and she became a professional writer and had a good career in that, and went on in romance and some other fiction. This was many, many years ago. I should add. This was well before any of you were born, I think. It was a long time ago. And there were some other writers that I found, but at least 97% of what I looked at went back to the people who wrote it with this completely insincere letter praising their writing, but explaining what was wrong. Well, I don't think I did many of them any good at all, but I learned from this what worked and what didn't. It was extremely helpful. Anyway, this is just to illustrate the point that you find out for yourself what works and what doesn't work on the page, because that's where you see it. A question that comes up often, and that I hear often in workshops, is people want to know, what do editors want, what do publishers want, what, and related questions, other ways of asking the same thing. And if I have one bit of advice to give, and I better, you already gave me a check for this. If I have one, it wasn't that big a check, so you can't expect much. If there's one bit of advice to impart, it's that you should not be concerned with what publishers want and what editors want and anything of the sort. And that the best long-term advice I can give you is to write what you want to write. You'll want to do so in such a way as to make it accessible to a reader, and to make it work for a reader, and to make it be effective as the book you want it to be. But I think you have to write your own book in order to get anywhere. And especially if you want to do this for a long time. I think sometimes that this can be commercially counterproductive, this advice I've just given to you, at least in the short run. I think if over the years I had been somewhat more calculating and somewhat less committed to writing what I felt like writing, I might have had considerably more success at the time. However, if I hadn't written first and foremost to please myself, I don't think that I'd have kept at it as long as I did. And I don't think I'd be in the situation I'm in now, where almost all of my early work is back in print. I don't think that would have happened. So I'm certainly happier with the way it went. Although there were times when I saw, a lot of people driving around in Cadillacs and eating at the Cirque, and wondered why I hadn't so arranged my life as to be able to do that, But on balance, I think I'm happy with this one. There'll be a lot of talk, probably, in the course of the Academy, for those of you who are here for the long haul. There'll probably be a lot of talk about the different categories of crime fiction. And it's long seemed to me that this labeling and categorizing, this is noir, this is private eye, this is that, is of considerably more interest to booksellers and librarians and people wanting to know where on the shelf to place the book than it is to those of us who write them. I find it not that important, not that instructive to think in categorical terms that way. And I think there's a lot less difference than one thinks about the person who writes cozies and the person who writes hard-boiled. And there's a lot less different about the process than you might imagine. I myself have written books that get labeled hard-boiled and books that are relatively light and frothy in that. And understandably, non-writers who read the books assume that writing a dark book is a dark experience, and that writing something light and bubbly, the writer is sitting there giggling, typewriter all day. And that's not true. The two experiences are almost identical. Because the problems that one confronts are the same. How do I write this scene so that it comes out? What should happen next? The problem of determining what happens next is the same irrespective of the mood of the book. The problem of getting words on the page or the screen or however you're doing it is the same irrespective of the mood of the book or the category of the book or any of the rest of it. It's more about finding the essence of the story, the essence of the characters within oneself and transferring it to page or screen than it is about anything else. The content, the nature of the content is almost beside the point. And another area, and someone might bring this up as a question, but I'll address it now just in case no one does. and that's the question of the way in which the whole world of publishing is changing at warp speed. You've probably noticed this. And even to summarize it is difficult and probably superfluous, but bookstores are essentially disappearing. E-books are taking a greater share of the market almost every month. Commercial publishers are finding fewer books that they think they can do anything with. And they are also, in the main, quite nervous and feeling very much threatened by the rising tide, not only of e-books in which they're participating, but of self-publishing, which they think is threatening and which they're probably correct to see as threatening. So exactly where all of this is going, nobody quite knows. In fact, and this may be true of every aspect of life today, but it's certainly true of writing and publishing, and that's that anybody who thinks he knows what it's going to be like in 5 years is nuts. It's unknowable at this point, I think. I do know that it gives the writer more options than he or she has ever had. I'm talking specifically of self-publishing, because it's said that self-publishing levels the playing field, and to an extent it does. Anybody with a minimal budget can take his or her novel and put it on the market. But more than leveling the playing field, I think what's extraordinary is the extent to which this changing world of publishing has broadened the playing field. Even as commercial publishers increasingly say they can't do this book because the audience is too small, they can't do this because it doesn't fit into a category. Even while all of this is happening, the ability to e-publish a book and put it out there allows it to find an audience that might otherwise seem to be too small and too specialized for it. I'll give you an example of a woman who wrote in response to a blog piece that I had, sometime last year. And she said that back in the 90s, she wrote half a dozen works of romantic suspense, light novels. And after circulating them, she realized that the publishing industry was not interested in the books she was interested in writing. She didn't get any responses that were encouraging enough, and she stopped. She said then, nothing changed but the technology. She said, and 15 years later, she saw that Kindle existed and that one could publish for Kindle. So she brought out half a dozen of her books, one by one. And she said she was not the promoter that John Locke and other people were. And she didn't do that much, and she didn't do a whole lot of social media or a whole lot of networking, but she did put them out. And she felt, and she priced them low, and she wasn't getting rich by any means, but she felt she'd done pretty well because in whatever it was, 6 or 8 months, she'd sold 80,000 books. Well, yeah, I thought she did. I thought so. And the thing is, she is not a household word. Nobody ever heard of her. I certainly haven't. I forget her name now. It's not important. But the books found readers, and she's continuing to write them. Anyway, I could go on with this, but it's sort of off our point, but it's something I wanted to toss into the hopper. I think at this point I would like to open it up and take questions. You were warned about this, so you've had plenty of time to think of it. And we'll see where it goes.
Can I make a comment in relation and then turn it into a question?
All right.
Crime Fiction Academy doesn't care about those categories at all. And I have agreed about, cozies or hard-boiled or any of that, really. We've talked about it, but nobody really cares. But I will say that I heard a really funny thing the other day that everyone might like here, which is that in several bookstores, The Orchid Thief was put in the gardening section, and The Perfect Storm was in the travel section. So there you go. But I have a question for you. Because you were talking about, well, there were two things about how you learned from reading or looking at other, you were talking about specifically your, that work when you did it, that sort of editorial work, but and then you've gone on to write books about the craft and about writing, but were there books in particular that you felt, aside from these manuscripts, were there books in particular that you deconstructed, that you tore apart, that you looked at, or was it just reading them that gave you things?
No, I never read anything in the manner you just described. No. While I was starting to write crime fiction, which is what I started out writing, I read a tremendous quantity of it. In fact, that was when I first was introduced to this building, which was just down the block from where I was working. It was then called the Mercantile Library. And unlike other libraries, it didn't get rid of popular fiction after the first couple of years, as generally happens in most circulating libraries, so that they had works of various mystery writers way back into the 40s and that. And I read an enormous amount. I bought back issues of crime fiction magazines in quantity and read them, but I just read them as a reader. And I think the effect was that without reading analytically and thinking about it, by immersing myself in the material, I developed on an unconscious level, which is the only place that it's important to have it, a sense of what works and what doesn't. Having this up here intellectually does nothing for you. It may make you a better critic, but it won't make you right. You have to internalize it. Yes?
So that suggests that you might not sit out and plot a whole novel before you sit down and write. Or do you do that?
The question is do I suppose, write out an outline for a book before writing it? That's a good question and an interesting one. I consider it a good question because I can probably do 10 minutes on it. I've done it both ways over the years. I've outlined and I've not outlined. I haven't done any outlining really in many years now. I'm comfortable enough just starting it. I will think about it for a while before I start, but beyond that, I don't. I know it's attributed to E.L. Doctorow. I'm not sure if he's the first person who said this, but the line is that writing a novel is like driving at night. You can only see as far as the high beams reach, but you can get all the way across the country that way. And I think it's a really excellent metaphor, because it is like that. All you really have to know is what's in this chapter, and by the time you get to the end of it, your lights are that much further down the road, and you can go on, or not, depends. It doesn't always work. An advantage, it seems to me, of not outlining is that you don't limit yourself. Your imagination is free to find its own way rather than being trapped into the idea that this is the plot, this is the story, and this is what I have to follow. And presumably that way the work can be more spontaneous and the prose and dialogue fresher and freer. But not necessarily. I think I only met him once or twice, but when I was writing, I was a couple of years behind a writer named Richard S. Prather, who wrote a series of books with a character named Shel Scott. And they were sort of, they were hard-boiled private eye fiction generically, but they were light. They were frothy. Scott was wisecracking and funny things happened in the books. And the books were really bubbly, and you really had an image reading them of a guy just sitting there having fun and giving his imagination free rein as he hammered at the typewriter. Long before I met him, I read an article by Prather who described his writing method. And he started off by writing a 2-page outline of the story. And then he expanded that into a 10 or 12-page chapter by chapter outline of the story. And then he wrote the book at about 30,000 words, writing each chapter but scheduling. And then he went at it another time and took the 30,000 words and expanded that into about a 60,000 word book, and that was the book. And that sounded about as free and spontaneous as working at a rock pile, you know, making little ones out of big ones. But the way it came out was positively effervescent. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as it's the way that works for you. Nobody cares reading a book whether it's first draft or 10th draft. They care about whether or not they care about the story, you know? So that it's really very much an individual matter. What worked for Prather would not have worked for me. I would have stopped writing forever if I thought that was how you had to do it. Reminds me, Jonathan mentioned writing books, and I'm in the curious position of having written at this point about 7 instructional books for writers, and I can only recall one that I read, and I read that very early on. It was while I was working at Scott Meredith, and I was publishing magazine fiction, but I thought I really wanted to write a novel, and I didn't quite know how you went about doing that. And a friend of mine, a fellow named John Dobbin, who was working at the desk across from mine, who had published a contemporary novel with Avon, and said that there was a book he'd written, that he'd read rather, that he found very valuable. And I forget the title of it, but it was a guy, it's long enough. It was by a fellow named Manuel Komroff, who taught at Columbia. And it was, you know, his method for writing a novel. So I got the book, and I read it, or read most of it anyway. And what you had to do, according to Komroff, was you went out first and you bought 3 packs of index cards. I forget whether he recommended the 3x5s or the 4x6s. But you bought 1 pack of white, 1 pack of pink, and 1 pack of blue. And the white were plot cards. The pink were character cards. And the blue were incident cards, or whatever the hell they were. I don't remember. I also may have got the colors wrong. And you construct this thing, you write about each of the characters and work about who does this and what her father did for a living and so on and all of that. And you get them and you lay out That's all you need to know about that. And the thing is, it probably worked for the kind of book Comrade Roth wrote, which were these multi-layered historical novels with, you know, all sorts of generations and everything going on. But once again, if I had to write books that way, I'd find another way to make a living. But it worked for Conroth, and it works for other people, so different things work.